Welcome to the Grain Centre 2021 Livestock Forum. I'm Sean McGrath, the Livestock Systems Research Pathway Leader at the Grain Centre. The Grain Centre for Agricultural Innovation is an alliance between Charles Sturt University and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. We are proud to have hosted livestock forums for more than a decade to showcase new and practical beef and sheep industry research and start discussions about key industry issues. We've come together for this event today from places far and wide, and we pay our respects to all First Nations elders, both past and present, from the lands on which we live and work. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of Aboriginal people to country. We acknowledge that many cultures live on this land today, and we should collectively respect the land, its past and present story, for our future generations to enjoy. Thanks to the sponsors for the event. Local Land Services Riverina is a gold sponsor for the forum and has been supporting the event for many years. This year, we are also supported by Meat and Livestock Australia, Nutrient Ag Solutions, Sheep Connect New South Wales, Animal Health Australia, ProWay Livestock Equipment, and Tees. With the current restrictions due to COVID-19, we made the decision to move our forum online again this year, so we're glad you are with us. The forum is being recorded and you will be sent a link to watch again later. And you can see the program for today up on your screen at the moment. To the chat panel, we have some great presenters and topics for discussion on today's forum, so please put your questions in the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen and make use of the chat panel to interact with the presenters and each other. You will see there are 3 sections on the chat panel. The public section, you can type in a question and everyone online will be able to see this question. In the private section, you can have a private conversation with any other person that is online. And in Q&A, you can type in your question and others will see it and can hit upvote to push the question to the top of the list. We will have a morning tea break between 10:30 and 11 a.m. During the break, we will be running videos from our sponsors and you can talk with them in the chat window. Please make sure to check out the videos and support our sponsors. I'll now hand over to chair our first session, Charles Sturt University Professor of Food Sustainability, Niall Blair.
Well, thanks, Sean, and good morning, everyone. It's a real honour to be able to chair this first panel session this morning. So what we're going to do is, first of all, hear from some of our panellists. They're going to give a short 15-minute presentation just on their subject, and then we're going to come together as a forum to have a bit of a chat. So as Sean said, please load in your questions into the Q&A panel, and we'll be able to make sure that we get those directed to each of our panellists. This first session is brought to you by Meat and Livestock Australia, and we really like to thank them for sponsoring this panel session this morning. So what we're going to do now is hear from our panellists. So we have with us this morning Doug McNicholl from Meat and Livestock Australia. We have Dr. Cathy Waters from New South Wales DPI, Stuart Austin from Wilmot Cattle Company, and also Michael Gooden from RCS Australia. And also joining us for the panel session will also be Dr. Susan Orgill from New South Wales DPI. So our first presenter this morning is Doug McNicholl from MLA, and Doug is the Sustainability Innovation Manager at Meat and Livestock Australia. He oversees an estimated $18 million per annum investment into innovation processes where sustainability considerations along the lines of environmental, social and economic are integrated into the Australian red meat value chain from idea generation through to commercialisation. So Doug's going to give us a presentation this morning on an overview of the Australian red meat industry's carbon neutral by 2030 initiative. So over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Niall. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. MLA is a proud sponsor of today's event. I'm very pleased to be working with excellent research centres like the Graham Centre. I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking with you about the Australian red meat industry's carbon neutral 2030 initiative and what MLA's are doing to support it. Just before I do, a little bit about MLA. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a not-for-profit research and development corporation, and it's the service provider to the Australian red meat industry. We undertake research, development, adoption and marketing activities to support the prosperity of the Australian red meat industry. We also carry out various marketing activities domestically and internationally across 100 markets. So we're a large industry making a significant contribution to the Australian agricultural economy and the Australian economy more broadly. One thing we're not, though, is that we're not an industry representative body or lobby group. These roles are undertaken by our peak industry councils. So I'll just move on to a little bit about the agenda for today. So the slides have just skipped forward a little bit there, so I'll just pull them back. Three key parts to work through. One is the description of the industry's carbon neutral 2030 initiative, the rewards for producers who are climate smart, and what progress the industry is making under the initiative at this point in time. I'm then going to talk to you about some of the key work areas that MLA has designed for the sector, and then leave you with some steps to a carbon neutral position, acknowledging that a number of you in attendance today operate red meat businesses. So as I say, we're starting off with the description of the initiative. Before I get into describing specifically, I just want to start with the context of this initiative in the industry strategy. So the Australian red meat industry's Red Meat 2030 strategy, which is released by the Red Meat Advisory Council a few years ago, it sets out the vision of doubling the value of red meat sales as the trusted source of the highest quality protein. So that's doubling the value of sales from 27.5 billion to just under 60 billion by 2030, which would be the lion's share of the National Farmers Federation $100 billion aspiration for agriculture by 2030. And our insights are we'll achieve that by focusing on product quality and in maintaining consumer and community trust for the sector. And our insights are that there are three key measures for us to consider in maintaining trust and to grow value. And one is in reinforcing our role as a highly nutritious food source. Secondly, reinforcing our role as responsible environmental stewards. And thirdly, reinforcing our roles as being responsible custodians of the animals upon which enter our food chain. And so MLA, alongside various RDC partners and industry stakeholders, identifying opportunities to generate and capture value for producers through environmental service provision during red meat production. And that's honing in on commercialising the service that red meat producers provide alongside the production of red meat by looking after the environment of which we are custodians. And this includes low carbon and carbon neutral livestock, but it also includes other environmental issues. But today I'm just going to be talking to you about climate and carbon related opportunities. In 2017, the industry launched the Carbon Neutral by 2030 initiative, and that was on the back of some landmark research undertaken by CSIRO that investigated the question whether the sector could achieve a carbon neutral position. And this means that by 2030, the Australian beef, lamb and goat production sectors, that also includes lot feeding and processing, can achieve a carbon neutral position, which means net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So on one hand, reducing the emissions that are released as a process of producing red meat, and at the same time offsetting emissions in Australia's landscape using nature-based solutions. Progress under the initiative is captured at the industry level using the Australian Commonwealth Government's National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And the inventory is what Australia uses to communicate progress on a global scale. And so the industry also taps into that inventory and tracking progress over time. So I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about the rewards. It's obviously really important that we understand what's in this for us. Why are we doing this? What is going to get us out of bed in the morning to take on the innovation that we need to move us from where we are today to a carbon neutral and productive and profitable future? And so there are five kind of key, or insights there are five key categories of reward. The first is, and not surprisingly on the left-hand side, maintaining consumer and community support for the sector. And that's ongoing trust and custom of consumers. And by staying ahead of what are emerging trends and have been around for a little while and continue to grow, that suggests demand for environmentally responsible food production systems, initiatives like the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative put us on the front foot. Sorry, I've got a little gremlin there moving slides. I'm just going to try and move that back. The second category area is around market access issues. So any of the businesses that are trading internationally understand that international consumers are looking for certain attributes of products to get access to market. And in high value markets, the emerging requests for information are around low carbon and carbon neutral product. And so by being on the front foot again, we stay well and truly in the eye and the purchasing power of high value international markets. Access to capital is another reward mechanism. We're not only access, but even getting discounts for interest rates for low and zero carbon products. And we've seen some agribusiness banks recently try to incentivize action in this area by releasing low interest loans. Another thing that's close to the heart for business operators in Australia is by maintaining being ahead of the curve. We stay ahead of policy intervention in the sector, in particular state and federal government regulation. So by businesses being good custodians of the environment and the animals we look after, we negate the need for intervention or regulatory intervention. And finally, and what's really important, is there are multiple wins that can be achieved by adopting technologies and practices in this area. So technologies and practices that maintain animal productivity in the face of increasing temperature and rainfall variability. Technologies and practices that improve the quality of the land in which we try to produce food. And we know if we do those things well, it's going to be good for business. It's going to be good for consumers. And not surprisingly, this means increased revenue over time and growth in trust and continued trust in the sector. A little bit of progress over time. So the Australian red meat industry has dramatically reduced net greenhouse gas emissions relative to the baseline year of 2005, which is the Australian federal government's baseline year for communicating progress under the Paris Agreement. Now, the key drivers for that have been a significant increase in woody vegetation, predominantly in Northern Australia, that has offset emissions. For us to achieve a carbon neutral position by 2030, our focus is really on livestock enteric methane emissions, but through the lens of productivity opportunities. So technologies that convert methane lost as a byproduct of digestion into a productivity pathway for the animal. Because if we do that, it's great for the animal, it's great for business, it's also good for the environment. Now, we're also one of the only sectors in the economy, in fact, the only sector in the Australian economy to be able to make a claim of significant emissions reduction. Every other sector has increased relative to the baseline year. That's a fundamentally amazing statement for a sector to be able to make, and we're very proud to be able to communicate that to the community. And so, yes, very pleased to be able to demonstrate that. I also want to point out that our contribution not only our contribution to national emissions has reduced, but also the presence of the sector is a contribution to in relation to other sectors has declined substantially over time as well. But we've got to make sure that we're doing our bit, and that's what we're focused on in this initiative. Also want to point out that for various geographic reasons and climatological reasons, there's a very good reason why the Australian red meat industry is the custodian of more than half of Australia's land mass. That is because rainfall, soil type, temperature change, we're in a very hot and dry climate that limits agricultural production opportunities in a large area of land to ruminant agricultural production. And by doing that, ruminants can upcycle what is ordinarily low quality grasses in pastures into a nutrient-dense food for consumers. In moving on, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the key work areas under the industry's Carbon Neutral 2030 Roadmap, which you can see just on the left-hand side of this image, and encourage you, if you want to have a look at that, you can download it from the MLA website or just punch into Google MLA CN30 Roadmap. You'll learn in there are 4 key work areas, and it all begins with promoting industry leadership on this issue. And that's providing leadership opportunities or to develop new and emerging leaders, whether they're producers, light feeders, processors, or advocates for the sector. Secondly, the next 2 areas are technology and practice related. So first is a technology and practice area focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in grazing, lot feeding and processing. And they're technologies like feed additives that avoid methane emissions and improve livestock productivity gain, grazing management practices that promote or expedite the time at which livestock get to market. In doing so, reduce methane emissions along the way. Also looking at tropical legumes or temperate legumes that improve feed-based quality but provide various benefits to soils along the way, as examples of technologies in that area. The third area is around promoting carbon storage. And so this is using plants that animals and livestock can either graze or shade and shelter under, and in doing that, provide an environmental benefit in the form of carbon storage or even biodiversity benefits alongside animal productivity gains. And the fourth area is around integrated management systems, which is pulling together the management systems at a farm level to enable measurement, reporting, and participation in what are new and emerging markets for carbon credits, even biodiversity credits, alongside red meat production. Getting towards the back end of the presentation now, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the steps to a carbon neutral position. So how could you move from an interested stakeholder today into being recognised as providing low carbon or carbon neutral red meat product? The first thing is it's really important to understand your personal and organisational drivers and goals in this area. That's a fundamental building block upon which you make decisions. And you'll hear from Stuart Austin in particular about his story, which is a great testament of moving from an idea into a commercial business opportunity. The next step is to then establish a baseline, understand where you are as a business. So understand your livestock productivity, your land productivity, and as a byproduct of that, you will understand your greenhouse gas emissions position. Once you've done that, you can evaluate what technologies and practices are presently available or will be available in the not too distant future to help you either reduce emissions or, moving on to step 4, evaluate nature-based solutions to offset your emissions. And the primary focus is typically within the farm boundary. Once you've done that, if you wish to then communicate or be rewarded for your action in the market, you need to undertake a measurement and reporting mechanism such that the consumer who wishes to buy your environmental service or story can visualize that you've been certified and you've been validated as providing that service as point of consumption, at the point of consumption. Now, lastly, also, don't forget to seek advice. There's advice through land services, there's advice, so state government organisations, there's advice through industry organisations like MLA. Seek out your local producers who may be interested or have taken action in this area. And there are various commercial farm advisors who are also making active, providing active services in this area. So seek out advice. I encourage you to. And moving towards the last few slides now, there are some really good examples of early movers of businesses that are varying scale who have stepped into carbon neutral production. Arcadian Organic is an organic meat production business based out of Toowoomba in Queensland who have launched a product line in this area. NAPCO, a North Australian pastoral company, Fi's Founders brand, has launched a brand in this area. And a southern business or southern retail business, Flinders & Co, have also launched products in these areas. So there are businesses making serious moves. For industry to be successful, there are 3 key areas of focus. We need to maintain industry commitment to this initiative. If commitment wanes, we're not going to achieve what is a very challenging aspirational goal for the sector. We must remain committed. We need the right policy settings. Now that includes industry policy settings through peak industry councils, as well as supporting policy settings at a government level. And also, not surprisingly, we need to maintain our focus and investment in research and development and adoption of the promising technologies that you'll be hearing about today. And I encourage you to reach out to MLA if you'd like to understand what technologies and practices might be suitable to you. And I'll leave you with this, a vision statement for the sector in relation to this initiative by 2030. Just imagine that by 2030, consumers buy Australian red meat product knowing that it's good for the environment. So by 2030, consumers buy Australian red meat product knowing that it's good for the environment. And if we do this, I believe that we will make a demonstrable contribution to doubling the value of sales as a trusted source of the highest quality protein. Thank you for the time and look forward to other presentations today.
Well, thanks, Doug. That was a really great insight into what's happening in the sector more broadly. And we've already started to generate some questions coming through, at least one there on the Q&A, which we'll get to in the panel session a little bit later on. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question that you'd like to be put to our presenters in the panel session, just jump in that Q&A part there. And once again, thanks to MLA for getting behind today. And thanks, Doug. And we'll look forward to speaking to you on that panel session. Our next panelist that we're going to hear from in a presentation is, I guess, a good flow on from moving from the industry, an industry that says that we still need to do more research into this space. And that's Dr. Cathy Waters from New South Wales DPI. And Cathy is a principal research scientist and a leader of climate research in the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Her current research is focused on carbon emissions reduction and sequestration that aims to create opportunities to integrate abatement in agricultural systems and increase farm business resilience. So Cathy's going to speak to us about transitioning the agricultural sector to a decarbonised economy. So thanks, Cathy, and over to you.
Thanks, Niall. And this follows on really well to what Doug was saying. So in this presentation, I'm going to outline some of the options for decarbonisation and the sort of quantum of abatement that we think we can achieve from New South Wales agriculture. So, sorry, this keeps floating backwards and forwards. So in the presentation, I'm going to outline some of those drivers, which you've heard a little bit about those from Doug previously, but also to outline some of the feasible abatement options that we have modelled for New South Wales agriculture, and then finally finishing up on describing how the New South Wales Primary Industries Productivity and Abatement Program is going to help deliver some of that decarbonisation. So we're getting some very clear market signals, particularly from the European markets, around the need to decarbonise. So some of those strongest signals have really come over recent months over discussion around the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that would essentially see goods produced in countries like Australia without a carbon tax receive a tariff that equalises the playing field with European producers where there is a carbon tax. And other countries like the United States are also considering border adjustment tariffs, and Canada and Japan have also recently announced similar sort of moves. As you've just heard from Doug too, there's this increasing need to, increasing requirement to demonstrate environmental stewardship in particular and sustainable land management practices from agricultural land use. And that's a major driver to maintain our social licence to operate. And many producers have already made that move to capitalise on demonstrating that environmental stewardship through labelling and branding of products. But a major driver also comes from federal and state government levels. So with the federal government, the Emissions Reduction Fund is the centrepiece of its action on climate change. So that's a $4.5 billion fund to invest in abatement activities across Australia. And the New South Wales recently in 2019 released the net zero plan to achieve net zero by 2050. And as part of that plan, the Prime Minister's Productivity and Abatement Program has a major emphasis on driving the uptake of proven emissions reduction technologies and investing in that next wave of emissions reduction and innovation. So Doug sort of outlined this, what is meant and needed by net zero. But currently what we have is an imbalance between the amount of emissions from fossil fuel use from energy generation from households and agriculture, and the amount of carbon that is captured in the system. So achieving a balance requires not only a reduction in emissions, but also an increase in the amount of carbon that is stored. So this next slide shows a graph of the total emissions across New South Wales by sector, and the green outlines the proportion of contribution to those emissions from the agricultural sector. So in 2018, that was about 18 megatons of CO2 equivalent, which roughly equates to about 14% of the total emissions in New South Wales. What I really wanted to highlight with this slide is that within the agricultural sector, by far the greatest source of emissions is methane. So it's about 70% from enteric methane, shown there in red, and nitrous oxide is around 17%, and manure management is about 8%. So livestock emissions contribute to about 3/4 of the total emissions in the sector. So looking at some of the modelling that we did last year to estimate how much abatement from New South Wales ag sectors could feasibly be achieved. By feasibly, what I'm really meaning is without any compromise to agricultural production, so without taking to trade off one land use for another land use. So just looking at emissions reduction here on the left-hand side, that graph shows that combined that the management of livestock methane and manure could provide 2.4 megatons of CO2 equivalent in the year 2030 if we were to sustain high rates of adoption. It's a fairly small amount when you compare to the total emissions of 18 megatons in New South Wales. And these estimates are really based on assumptions around what livestock numbers are going to do into the future. And so it assumes that some of those ongoing trends around a reduction in dairy herd sizes or an increased trend in feedlotting will continue, and there'll be high rates of adoption in feedlots. And some of the herd management activities which have production benefits are also assumed to be widely adopted in grazing systems. So what are the real production benefits and some of those barriers for adoption? So this next slide outlines some of those where we think are the most opportunities for emissions reduction in livestock. Methane produced by livestock essentially represents a waste of energy. So any strategies to reduce methane will not only address climate, but can also improve productivity. So strategies fall into two categories, so dietary approaches and then whole system approaches. And we think that with the dietary approaches, these three approaches, feeding nitrates, 3-NOP, and red seaweed asparagopsis, provide very promising opportunities to reduce emissions. And that technology, particularly for the latter two, is likely to be available in the next few years. But there are major barriers, particularly for 3-NOP and asparagopsis, for adoption around moving allowing delivery mechanisms, so we can move the use of as dietary supplements from more intensive to more extensive enterprises. Some of the whole system practices are real winners in terms of being able to enhance productivity, increase the use of feed efficiency, or reduce emissions intensity. So herd management such as culling unproductive animals and supplementary feeding to enhance reproductive performance, and adding watering points to reduce distance walk to water, those sorts of things are clear activities that can be undertaken to help to reduce emissions. But again, some of those barriers around the costs and some of those uncertainties around the impact of feed additives on production and meat and milk quality need to be tested. And until we've got enough material that we can test at scale, we're not going to have a really clear indication of how well some of those activities will work. So looking at the other side of the coin, the sequestration side of things, this map shows the current delivery of abatement and the extent and the scale of carbon farming across Australia. So by carbon farming, I'm referring here to the federal government's Emissions Reduction Fund project. So these are activities that have occurred over the last sort of 5 to 7 years. So currently about 80% of the federal government's emissions reduction are being met from the agricultural sector. And most of this is through the management of biomass. In New South Wales, ERF projects that are currently contract a value of greater than $1.4 billion. So it's a large amount of money. There's about 330 projects over New South Wales, and those projects are over about 7.9 million hectares, which a majority of those are in the Western Division. So the past research that we've undertaken in DPI in the Western Division has shown that much of that the dollars that have been earned from carbon farming has been redirected into the enterprise, in some cases improving the landscape condition, purchasing new properties, but it's been to the advantage of the landholders in that area. So we wanted to see how much opportunity there really was for participation in emissions reduction fund activities across Australia. So those across New South Wales, I'm sorry. So these three maps show some of the areas that we think are suitable for natural regeneration, for environmental plantings and mallee plantings and soil carbon projects across New South Wales. So mapping those areas suitable, we were able to, this is the same slide as I showed you previously, but we were able to provide estimates of different vegetation and soil management activities to increase sequestration over a 10-year period, 2020 to 2030. So the values here are cumulative and they're estimated for activities starting in 2020 and now for biomass only. So there's a potential to deliver a large amount of abatement. So about 57.8 megatons of CO2 equivalent by 2030, and a further 20 megatons very conservatively could be achieved through soil carbon management. So that compares to the 18 megatons that are produced in terms of emissions by agriculture in 2018. So it was providing a significant amount of an opportunity for abatement. These are just estimates for biomass. If we include the soil carbon that's associated with that vegetation growth, that's amplified even further. So if you look particularly at the use of mixed species environmental plantings there in blue. There's 7.9 megatons in biomass and a further 24 megatons of CO2 equivalent for sequestration with that activity. So these are fairly conservative estimates, and they're based on really low rates of adoption in industry, about 5 to 10% adoption, and assuming that about 20% of that farm would be managed through carbon through vegetation in soils. We think that that's realistic to achieve that level of adoption because of the production and the enterprise benefits that are associated, all these co-benefits that are associated with increasing biomass. So increasing soil productivity, increasing providing provision of shade and shelter for land survival and production. These are things that we've known about for a fairly long while. There's also opportunities for creating forage reserves, but also for additional income, not just through carbon farming under the ERF, but also for product labelling and farm forestry. And these are associated also with environmental benefits, and particularly in fragmented landscapes, where landscape connectivity of vegetation can increase the extent and the scale of habitat for biodiversity, along with addressing some issues around land degradation, increasing productivity in those degraded areas. But there are barriers to be able to understand how we can optimise and redesign landscapes best for abatement, and there's costs associated with some of those activities, in particular with entering into the emissions reduction fund methodologies. There's also issues around scale. Not every size project is marketable, and those barriers need to be able to be overcome. So if we're putting this all together, and we look at these pathways for decarbonisation in agriculture, so this black line just shows the emissions, which is a downward trend since 1990 for emissions from ag in New South Wales. And if we look at those modelled estimates for reduction with livestock activities, we still won't, emissions reduction alone won't go all the way to be able to reduce all of our emissions. But if we include the sequestration with the emissions reduction in livestock, it's quite a different story. So I want to be clear that this graph is just stylised. Trees don't grow in a straight line. They don't grow exponentially. But where we've included the management of vegetation that's either retaining native vegetation, including natural regeneration or environmental plantings, and we include the soil carbon beneath that vegetation, that's about 90 megatons cumulative between 2020 and 2030. So to fully decarbonise will take both emissions reduction and sequestration through vegetation and soil management. So I just want to have the next couple of slides to talk about the primary industries productivity and abatement program, which is part of the New South Wales Net Zero Plan, which is to deliver abatement, which aims to deliver abatement from primary industries and other land tenures. Specifically, it aims to support farmers and landholders to be able to integrate these proven technologies and practices to increase abatement and optimise productivity. It aims to support farmers and land managers to be able to access revenue from carbon markets and to realise market advantage from low emissions products. It's looking at to build a market for premium offsets and to deliver carbon abatement alongside environmental, economic, social and cultural outcomes. So the government's playing a significant role in streamlining these market operations and de-risking participation in these emerging markets and practices, and working to overcome some of these knowledge and skills deficits across the sector. So one of the ideas that we want to bring forward within this program is to test and respond in a really targeted way through a pilot project that looks at whole farm carbon management. So this has three elements: a whole farm carbon advice and planning service, which really looks at non-market abatement, and a concierge service to help navigate some of the complexities in the emissions reduction fund activities. So it includes abatement under the ERF as well as this non-market abatement activities. So just summarising the presentation, I just want to reiterate that many of the abatement activities, such as livestock emissions reduction and sequestration on farm through vegetation and soils, also have additional productivity benefits. And there is no clear one solution, but a portfolio of solutions that's required to be able to transition the sector into a low carbon one. And in part, a major obstacle that needs to be overcome is to be able to articulate the value proposition for farmers and how that could be realised through either established carbon markets or undertaking non-market abatement activity. And that can only be achieved in building on-farm capacity to enable farmers to be able to realise these opportunities and to make a transition to a decarbonised economy. Thank you.
Thanks, Cathy. That was great, and started to generate a fair bit of discussion in the Q&A section. So we'll get to some of those as we move into our panel session. So keep those questions coming. We're now going to hear from a practical on-the-ground experience in this space from Stuart Austin. And Stuart is the General Manager of the Wilmot Cattle Company, a grass-fed beef business based in the New England region of New South Wales. In 2019, Stuart was awarded the National Young Carbon Farmer of the Year award, and the business was recognised as a champion in the New South Wales Landcare Awards. So Stuart is going to talk to us about selling carbon credits to Microsoft. So over to you, Stuart.
You know, I would certainly like to think that our legacy will be the ecological restoration of these landscapes. You know, I take huge pride in what we do, and I can put my hand on my heart, you know, backed by an enormous amount of data to show that we are improving the ecological health of this farm. What we're demonstrating through our production system here is that we're massively climate positive, carbon positive, and through soil carbon sequestration, so taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and storing them in our soils. We're sequestering an enormous amount more than we're emitting every year, and all the while producing, you know, the most nutrient-dense beef that a person could eat. 3 or 4 years ago we set about planting trees, and we've now planted about 25,000 trees across this farm, and we're now implementing a tree planting program across our other 2 properties over the next few years to add back that whole layer of biodiversity that we had actually removed from our ecosystem. Just love getting out of bed every day and seeing the abundance that we're bringing back to these farms, and the life in our ecosystem, the health of our animals, the well-being and the morale of our people in our business, but doing that in a way that is underpinned by resilient agricultural businesses.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Niall, for the introduction, and thank you to the Graham Centre for the invitation to speak here this morning. It's a pleasure to be able to share a little bit about what we've done and a bit of our story, and I hope everyone gets something interesting from this. So just a bit of a quick background of where we're from. So I live up here at Wilmot. That footage was from Wilmot at Ebor, where we manage about 4,500 acres. We also have another 6,000 acres at near Walker, and about 4,000 acres we recently purchased 2 years ago out at Kelvin, just north of Gunnedah. So operating across 3 landscapes, about 14,000 acres, largely a trading operation, turning over between 4,000 and 5,000 head a year of cattle, but also have about 1,000 breeding females in the inventory as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about regenerative agriculture today and how we manage our production system and the things that we focus on and why we focus on those things, as well as, you know, in the second half of my presentation, getting to what we've done in the carbon space around selling carbon credits. So this term can be somewhat polarising to a lot of people in our industry, and my intention is not to create a divisive conversation here or debate here, but one of the best, what it means to me, I suppose, is this is a quote that I heard from Gabe Brown about 5 or 6 years ago, when the terminology regenerative agriculture was first started being used, and that was that we have to actually acknowledge that globally our soil resources have become largely quite degraded, and so why would we want to talk about sustainable agriculture and sustaining a resource that's become degraded? We actually need to talk about regenerating that soil, and so and shifting the way we think about doing that. So that's basically what we've done, and what a lot of people in sort of a regenerative agriculture sphere are focused on, and I'll get to some principles shortly around how we're doing that. So to that point, we managed to set of principles, not practices, and we're basically, our intention is to use as many different species of plants and animals to restore the landscape and its biodiversity, including all things, plants, animals, vegetation, grass species, etc., with minimal inputs at low cost, and we're pretty close to a no input system here now. So broadly speaking, what this means in our context, where we are a grazing business, primarily livestock, we've got a very small amount of cropping still happening at Morocco that by next year will be completely phased out. But effectively, we're talking about using large mobs of animals, moving frequently across the landscape, grazing a very small area for a very short period of time, and then not coming back to that land until that pasture has sufficiently recovered to be grazed again. So we're basically, in a more sort of set out fashion, I suppose. We're talking about grazing principles, and these come from the RCS Grazing for Profit School, who you'll hear from Gooden shortly. But basically, we're constantly planning and monitoring our grazing. So are we moving too fast or moving too slow, which moves on to our second principle around rest period. We're constantly adjusting that rest period based on the growth rate of the plant. So at this time of year, it's winter time, very little growth. So we are extending our rest period quite considerably. Leads on to the next point there around stocking rate being adjusted to match carrying capacity. So that's basically what we've done. Our stocking rate right now is a lot lower than what it is in the summertime when we get our growing season rainfall. Our pastures are growing a lot faster. That's when we start to increase our stocking rate and shorten our rest period. Managing livestock effectively, talking about sufficient feed and water at all times, but also the what we focus on there is the psychology of our animals and the headspace of animals, and making sure that they're in a really good frame of mind to be for production at all times, and maximising stock density for minimum time. These principles very deliberately are in order of priority and importance. So we make sure we've got those first 4 principles right before we start trying to increase our stock density. But stock density is one of the most powerful tools we have for landscape restoration. And so that's something we focus on quite heavily here. We're continually challenging how high a density we can manage our livestock, keeping them in the right frame of mind, keeping them putting on weight, but also increasing the rate of ecological change on these farms. And fundamentally, that's what's changed this landscape across not just this farm, but our property at Walker, and is changing the landscape at our property at Gunnedah. And the last point there around biodiversity, using a diversity of plants and animals to improve ecosystem services. So as I mentioned there earlier, we're focused on as much diversity through our pasture sward as we can get, which creates as much diversity underground in our root systems. That's really creating a change in our soil carbon levels and our soil health overall, as well as trees, vegetation. As I said in that video, we've planted an enormous amount of trees here, and we're continuing to do so. We're a long way from finished yet. We've planted basically all native species and more than 50 different types of native species across the farm here so far, and that number will continue to grow. So we're looking for lots of diversity all the time, and also diversity in animals. So we want to create an environment that's beneficial to all kinds of bugs and insects and bees and birds and native animals, as well as livestock. We are presently only grazing cattle. We did have sheep at Morocco for a short period this year. There's plenty of examples of people using chooks and pigs as well in the landscape. So diversity in all things, and that really goes back to how Mother Nature managed this landscape in that if you look at at a native ecosystem, there is you never see a monoculture and you never see straight lines. So that's what we're trying to get back to, is really how Mother Nature managed the landscape. One of the key things here in this business is our decision making, and this is where I just want to briefly touch on why grazing as our most powerful tool. It allows us to do a lot of things. It enables us to manage our grass inventory, our livestock inventory, our rest period, our short-term graze planning, our longer-term stocking rate forecasting, all those things critically day to day at an operational level, which all relate back to those grazing principles that I mentioned earlier. And so that, decision making in our business is absolutely critical every day, and we make decisions every day, and we need to make informed decisions with data. And that's what Maya's enabled us to do, is capture all that data around our grass and our grazing, such that we can make really sound decisions around our feed available relative to our stock on hand. The next point there is that as part of this Microsoft deal that I'm about to talk about shortly, is that it created two things. One, it was a database of all our graze yield data that was used in all the calculations, and secondly, it was the validation tool for us to be able to demonstrate the practice change that we'd undertaken over the last few years, which, in order to participate in any kind of carbon project, you need to be able to demonstrate practice change. So, it was a really critical part of this carbon credit project that we executed. But it's also a really valuable, probably one of our most valuable operational tools day to day. So carbon, why are we going to talk about carbon? For us, carbon has always been a proxy for ecological health. We soil test across all our farms every May across multiple sites, and we have been doing so for more than 10 years now across the two farms we've owned for that long. We look at every factor across our soil: P, N, S, calcium, magnesium, everything, all our trace minerals, and we also look at carbon and the relationship between all those macro and micronutrients. And what we observed over time was, as our practice change happened, as our grazing management changed, as we increased the density of our animals, our soil carbon levels started to improve. And so the carbon has kind of been our proxy indicator for ecological health, as well as what we're obviously seeing in the paddock and things like biodiversity assessments as well, looking at how much more diversity we have in our pasture sward and across the farm. So there's a few key points I just want to make here. One is that we are a beef production business first and foremost. Our guys get out of bed every day to think about how they can put more kilos of beef, grow more grass to put more kilos of beef on animals to make more money from beef production every day. What animals have we got to sell today? What animals can we replace? That's what they're thinking about every day. We don't get out of bed every day thinking about carbon. I probably do, given the position that I'm in, and the role that I play in the business. But our guys fundamentally are beef production managers. But as a byproduct of that, we have been able to increase our soil carbon. We don't claim to be carbon farmers. That terminology gets thrown around quite a bit. To me, that more relates to sort of the HIR guys, the Savannah burning guys, who are generating more income from carbon farming than they are from their production business. For us, carbon has been an additional co-benefit, an additional revenue stream, but our primary income source is certainly still beef production. As I mentioned there earlier when I was talking about my data is our greatest asset. And anyone who knows me knows that I'm all about the numbers. It's all about data, and we have data across every different parameter of this business, because without that, we can't. We manage risk through our approach to grazing management using animals, not input. So risk is another big thing that I talk about a lot. I think there's enormous risk in our agricultural businesses these days, and every time we buy something else, we can add to the fertilizer, chemical, any kind of inputs, we're adding more risk. If it doesn't rain, then we don't get a return on that investment. And what we're trying to do is eliminate that risk by eliminating inputs, just using animals, not sticking our head in the sand and saying, well, it'll be fine, we don't need inputs because our soil health will be fine. We're still monitoring our soil health. And in fact, this year on this farm, we have not applied any inputs here for 2 years, almost 2 years. And in the last 12 months, our P levels have gone up, our N levels have gone up, and our carbon levels have gone up. So We're slowly starting to demonstrate. It was quite a big call to go to sort of a zero input strategy, but we're starting to recognise that this may be possible. And in doing so, we've eliminated so much risk from the business financially. So the end result being that we've built quite an incredible amount of resilience into our business from climate extremes. Half this farm was burnt in 2019. Obviously, we went through the rip-roaring drought in 2019. Our farm at Ogle was completely destocked. This farm was destocked. We had 180 head in the inventory. But the response and the recovery in the first 6 months of last year was absolutely extraordinary, and certainly, relative to our neighbours, the amount of biomass and grass that we grew in that first 6 months really demonstrated to us that the decisions we made through the drought to preserve our ecology and our ecosystem and preserve cash really paid off. And so we believe, a real fundamental shift in grazing management across Australia will lead to significant benefits from a production perspective, financially, and create an opportunity through increased soil carbon levels for people to monetise that soil carbon. So what have we achieved? This is this farm at Wilmot. The yellow dots there are rainfall. That yellow dashed line is declining rainfall over the last 10 years. The red line is our soil carbon levels across 10 different sites across this farm, sampled every May each year. So the real shift in grazing management happened in about 2013. That's when things started to change. We hit a bit of a peak there in 2016, 17. Then we went through 3 very dry years. Half the farm was burnt in September 2019, and then we got a hell of a lot of rain. And over the last 12 months, we started to see an increase again from 4.7 to 5.2. The interesting thing there is that no change between 2019 and 2020. So that was a real testing point where, there's a common thought pattern that carbon is volatilised in dry periods. You lose all that soil carbon again, and through fires as well. This farm had both of those, and in fact, our soil carbon levels stayed the same. So that was a real sort of a proof point for us, I suppose, in that, and all I can put that down to is that we preserved as much ground cover as we could. We left plants in a real good phase, I suppose, suitable for growth as soon as it rained and enabled, response to rain. So there was still, while the landscape looked obviously very dry, and where it had been burnt very dead, there was still life there, I suppose, supporting that soil biology. And that's what helped us sustain those carbon levels through that period. So I'm going to briefly talk about the Microsoft deal. This was an arrangement that we came to. Impact Ag, who's a consulting company in Armidale, real specialist in natural capital. Toby Grogan there was the lead on this. We worked on this for over 2 years with these guys in the States who were a startup business looking at using remote sensing and blockchain to monetize soil carbon. It was a private market credit, so this has got nothing to do with ERF. We sold credits from this farm and from our farm at Walker. Doesn't have anything to do with our farm at Gunnedah. We were able to also tick off on some additional co-benefits here, and this was a real attraction to Microsoft in that they weren't just buying a carbon credit, sort of a token carbon credit, I suppose. They were actually buying a whole story here of ecosystem, regeneration, restoration, I suppose, and ecologically healthy beef production, food production, and that we're able to demonstrate that improvement in ecosystem health through our whole and soil health through the biodiversity assessments and the soil health data that we had, all our soil tests, so they could see that across the board. It wasn't just soil carbon. Animal welfare, we actually used the LPA accreditation and some other metrics there to demonstrate our and verify our animal welfare. So all that was added in so that Microsoft were, like I say, they bought a whole story, not just a token credit. As I mentioned, on-ground samples have been taken, 15 centimetre soil samples at the same sites at the same time of year over the last 10 years. So there was a pretty significant data set behind this. And then they used remote sensing to extrapolate that out across both farms and calculate additional tonnes of carbon sequestered in our soils. Methane emissions were calculated and discounted, so everything we just heard about emissions there, that was all taken into account. We actually used an MLA pilot accounting, carbon accounting workshop that we've been through. We used that as a bit of a basis and then built on it to calculate our emissions. They were taken off the total tonnes sequestered. So all in all, we sold about a bit over 40,000 tonnes of CO2 over a 3-year period from 2017 to 2020 to Microsoft through the Regen network. Microsoft just happened to have an RFP out at the time looking for carbon credits, and we submitted this, or the Regen network submitted our credit. Out of 170 odd proposals they were submitted with, they accepted 25. Only 2 of those were soil carbon credits, being from here and from Woodburn. The accuracy of the whole deal was discounted by 25%. So the actual tonnes that we calculated sequestered was over 50,000. They discounted by 25% to get back to that 43,000. We were paid close to $500,000, which equated to about $62 a hectare per annum over the 2 farms. All vegetation is all excluded, as it is in any soil carbon project, much to our frustration. But essentially, we've put an additional 12,000 tonnes of carbon in our soil over these 2 farms over the last, or over that 3-year period, equating to about 4 tonnes a hectare. So that's what we did there. There's no doubt there's plenty of questions. We have spoken about this very widely. We don't believe that is the be all and end all to soil carbon projects. You know, there's a lot of things that we're continuing to work on and improve there under that model. But it was a demonstration basically of what may be possible. Over the last 6 months, there's been an extraordinary amount of activity now in the soil carbon space. As a result of that, there's all kinds of private and public market opportunities now coming to the fore, which is really exciting and creating opportunities for landholders. The other opportunity here is obviously through the Climate Solutions Fund, through the ERF, through a soil carbon project, and I've just thought it would be worthwhile briefly going through this. Without trying to create too much confusion, we have in fact baselined all 3 farms under the Climate Solutions Fund. When we were discussing our carbon credit with the Regen network, we had no idea whether that would be able to be sold or not, or whether it would be validated, or whether would anyone accept it to be credible enough. So at the same time, we went through the registration process with the ERF, the whole gamut. It's an extraordinarily in-depth process. Carbon Link were a great help to us there, as were RCS, and Impact Ag did all the legwork. But now, and we went through the process of baselining. So we have baselined all these farms down to a metre. And then in January this year, when we sold that carbon credit to Microsoft, we now have to remove these 2 farms, Wilmot and Woodburn, from that ERF project because of the permanence period, the reversal clause, etc., that is in the Regen deal, as it is in any carbon project. So these 2 farms will come out of that. However, we do have a pretty incredible data set here now. Morocco, our 3rd property at Gunnedah, because it's at the start of the journey, it's all upside there in terms of soil carbon. It was very low when we bought the place. That is still in this Climate Solutions Fund project. So if you're a producer listening in today, I think it's worthwhile considering this. This is the gold standard around the world. It is the most rigorous standard in the world. However, that's one of its downfalls, is that it's overly onerous and too rigorous and quite expensive to participate in. Also, subjects and topics that we've been contributing to trying to change. So if you intend to engage in a Climate Solutions Fund project, I would highly recommend engaging a project developer. And we, as I said, we use Carbon Link, and they are the leaders in soil carbon in Australia, I believe. Register a project, you need a land management strategy. This needs to be written by a 3rd party. So you need a consultant. Not many consultants have any idea what a land management strategy is. That's again something we're working with the ERF with, trying to suggest to them that why don't they just write a template for a land management strategy, a series of questions that need answering, because you need to demonstrate a practice change, and that's what needs to be written in that land management strategy, and that would make it simpler, easier for people to participate. Once the project is registered, they will tell you it'll take 90 days. I can assure you it's going to take at least 6 months. You would then baseline sample all your farm. It's broken up into CEAs. You need 1 metre core samples that are as deep as you can go. The deeper you go, the more carbon you potentially have to sell. You then implement the project, and this means implementing a practice change. So this has to be something you have not ever previously done on the farm. which is a barrier to entry. But there are a number of things on that list, things like intensifying grazing, applying lime, applying biochar, I think is now on there, using compost and, biological inputs. There's a whole gamut of things, multi-species plantings. There's a whole number of things there you can do. You need to do a bit of that every year to demonstrate that you have changed your practice, and that's what's led to an increase in soil carbon over your project period. You would then subsequently sample, typically in year 5 and year 10, to determine how much additional carbon you have sequestered. That is then audited by a third party. That additional carbon is converted into tonnes of CO2, which is a multiple of 3.67. So for every tonne of soil carbon, you have 3.67 tonnes of CO2 or ACCUs to sell. And then you're issued with ACCUs, current market price, I think pretty close to $20 a tonne. There's all kinds of forecasts as to where that's going, but it certainly stacks up financially now. There's a whole number of things that affect your capacity to sequester soil carbon, land type, soil type, rainfall, climate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's no real number around how big a parcel of land you need to be able to sequester a considerable enough amount of soil carbon to make it financially viable to participate in one of these projects. However, what we're really strongly advocating for is more implementation of technology under the Climate Solutions Fund, things like remote sensing, so that we can reduce the cost of participation, such that more and more people have the opportunity to participate in this, because it can add a considerable amount of additional revenue to your bottom line. So 3 key messages here: opportunities for producers. Focus on your production business first and how you can continue to improve grazing management. Look at ways that you can increase animal density, increase diversity in your pasture sward, and from that you'll generate a huge amount of abundance. And when you've got abundance and you've got plenty of grass, you've got plenty of opportunity. Data. You can't measure what you don't measure. So you need, in order for you to be paid for carbon, you need how much you have. It's a good idea to go out and take some soil samples before you consider any projects. Take some samples and look at where you're at right now today. Potentially go back to some sites that you might have taken samples from in the past and consider what's happened in that time period from the last sample to this sample. How's that piece of land been managed, and what's that done to your carbon levels? And the third thing is, do this as a co-benefit opportunity. Like I said earlier, soil carbon to us is not it's not the end game. It's not our number one priority. It's a co-benefit that we've been able to monetize and generate as an additional revenue stream for improved grazing management. Increasing soil carbon is good business. And that'll fundamentally benefit your production business. Do it for that reason alone before you consider doing it for any kind of monetary gain. You'll add far more resilience to your business ecologically and financially by shifting your focusing grazing management and focusing more on soil carbon. I think that's about it. I love that quote there, that we don't inherit this earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think about that every day. How can I create a really self-sustaining, abundant, healthy landscape here that potentially my kids can manage in the future? So thanks so much.
Thanks, Stuart. That was great. Really interesting and great to see some on the ground examples. A lot of questions coming through now in the Q&A tab, and maybe there's actually some that are directly directed to you, Stuart. So maybe you might jump in there and answer some of those, because we're pushing along here and we may not get as long on the panel session as we wanted. So we've got some of our experts busily answering those questions in the Q&A section there, which is great, which means even if we do run out of time, we're still getting an answer to those. So thanks again, Stuart.
No worries. Thanks, Doug. I will jump on there and answer some of those questions while I'm waiting.
Sounds good. Our last presenter is Michael Gooden from RCS. Michael is a 4th generation grazier who grew up on a mixed cropping, irrigation and livestock property in southern New South Wales. Mick has served as a member of the Holbrook Landcare Network and Murrumbidgee Landcare Inc. and as a regional agricultural landcare facilitator for the Riverina LLS. In 2021, Michael joined the RCS team as a senior advisor, and he's going to talk to us about carbon trading and I hopefully answer the question, is it worth it for Riverina livestock producers? So over to you, Mick.
Yeah, cheers. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. And yeah, this is great. Hopefully we can wrap up how it's been set up from Doug and Cathy and Stuart, and then we'll bring this back into the Riverina is the plan. So yeah, that's the question. Is it worth it? Is carbon trading worth it for Riverina livestock producers? So this statement was made by the co-founder of RCS, Terry McNicholl, at a National Party's party room meeting in 2019. And he was alluding to the fact that this whole space, the carbon storage and the environmental credits, is an opportunity now to actually improve the income for landholders, the co-benefits of it that will be provided. So we've heard a lot about soil carbon today, and what we're really talking about when we're talking about soil carbon is the organic carbon. This is where it's coming from in the soil. So it's stabilised organic matter. What is carbon? It's obviously part of a cycle. It's been around for a long time, 300 million years. And it's part of the birth, growth, reproduction. And what we're really wanting to do, sorry, these slides are playing up a little bit, is to talk about the practicalities of actually sequestering it in the soil. So where is it currently? There's about 820 gigatons in the atmosphere, and there's 610 gigatons in all the vegetation. And our annual emissions, which we've been sort of talking about, is about 9 gigatons. That's all the fossil fuels, everything that we actually use in the whole globe. And so what we're wanting to do is look at storing that profitably into the soil, into an existing pool of about 1,500 gigatons. Now, we've heard a lot about soil carbon. Why are we interested in it? There's two components to all this. There's the production benefits of increasing soil carbon, and then there's also the monetary component of getting paid to do that. So yeah, obviously from a production perspective, we've got better nutrient cycling, water infiltration, plant growth. There's obviously nutrients in the carbon when it's broken down. Water holding capacity is an extremely powerful outcome of improving soil carbon. So we're looking at increasing productivity, increasing our farm diversity if we're looking at going down the path of running a carbon project through two streams of income, one from a latent carbon source and others from the production benefits of improving the soil carbon. Now, this is a demonstration. This is shown this is speargrass coming out of central Queensland. This could be shown, with Phalaris or Coxfoot in the Riverina, but basically just showing the differences between different grazing managements on plant structure and showing how soil carbon can be sequestered into the soil through the liquid carbon pathway. Photosynthesis plays a massive role in storing soil carbon. So traditionally, we've been thinking of soil carbon as purely as organic matter, and the latest research is starting to show that the actual biological activity is also providing another avenue for soil carbon. And that, I think, in itself is the real, that's going to be what will drive a lot of the potential to be able to increase our storage rates over time. Some of this is data coming out of America saying that there is a big increase in soil organic carbon storage after you sort of reach about a 3% threshold. And that's basically coming from increased biological activity, which is where it gets really exciting. So this data here, we've probably potentially seen some of this before. This is very local data. How much carbon are we able to sequester? And we're really interested in, from a grazing management perspective, the time control grazing capacity. So this data here is looking at sort of 1 tonne to 1.5 tonnes sequestration per hectare per year in the top 30 centimetres. Now, Stuart touched on this briefly. To look at setting up a project, basically what you've got to do to start with is baseline the project. Hopefully these images come up reasonably well, but this is a project that's been done in southern Queensland. Every one of those red dots has been a soil test, and that's been put into a stratification, which is basically similar land classes that then can be accurately compared to each other for testing purposes. This is the testing rigs that we use. The industrial size, take a big core that goes down to 1.5 metres. Those cores are kept cool to increase the accuracy of the testing, and then these put through this. This is the world-leading, groundbreaking technology that's been developed between Carbon Link and the CSIRO. This is using a gamma ray to measure the soil strata all the way along. And the beauty about this is that it actually keeps the soil core intact, so that can be used to be remeasured into the future. So, getting all those results together, then we've gone and seen the different levels of carbon. We've gone from 40 tonnes in one area of the farm to a high of 155. So that's really the importance of getting that stratification and taking the different land classes and testing them separately so you can measure the differences. Stuart alluded to this before, the magic pudding. And this is what gets really exciting when it comes to the carbon space, because we're talking about storing tonnes of carbon in the soil, but we're actually selling carbon dioxide equivalents. And so there's a multiplier effect, which is one of the only multiplier effects that we have in agriculture of actually, we're storing soil carbon and we're multiplying that by 3.6 tonnes. And that is the real big question is will it be worth anything? So at this point in time, this graph is showing us various sequestration rates from 1 tonne to 1.5 tonne to 2 tonnes a hectare. And then this has all been calculated back to a cash flow annualised per hectare. So we're talking sort of $30 a hectare for a tonne of carbon. And this is taking into account using the existing methodologies that we've been talking about, and also using the discounts that are required under the current legislation. So the big drivers, like carbon is basically a commodity, the big drivers for carbon returns are the sequestration rate, tonnes per hectare, so our ability to manipulate that, the price of carbon, the cost of measurement at this point in time is a big factor because it needs to be a physical baseline measure, and it's a physical rig that has to get around. It's got a cost to be moved around, manned, and it needs to, it has to be very efficient. And obviously the scale of the project is really important. And I think that's one of the challenges at this point in time in the Riverina is the scale can be daunting. So this slide here really tries to flow a lot of these variables in together, looking at scale, sequestration rate, and the initial baselining and the project setup costs. So when you think about a lot of these numbers on here, we can get to a stage where if you've got good sequestration rates and some reasonable scale, then you're starting to generate a really great return. And this is in addition to any existing production returns that you'd be looking at. So Stuart touched on some of the regulations that are involved. We're big advocates for selling ACCUs through the Climate Solutions Fund, and I think that it's going to be the gold standard for how carbon needs to be traded around the world, and that's why we're really thinking that that's going to be the best way to be looking at selling this carbon. This is where it sort of sits. There's all different types of carbon and different offsets that can be applied, but we're looking at soil carbon. It's part of the land, it's part of agriculture, and obviously talking about the soil. So as opposed to sort of some of the things that Cathy was mentioning in her talk about vegetation, we're really focusing on the actual soil carbon sequestration. Some of the eligible activities that this is under the existing methodology, and there's a new methodology that's potentially coming out in later this year, and so there's hopefully some other additions that can be added to this. But yeah, so this is sort of gets around the question of additionality. What changes have you made in your business then that would then qualify you for a soil carbon project? So applying nutrients to the land, lime or gypsum, altering stocking rate, re-establishing perennial pastures, retaining stubble after harvest and converting from intensive tillage to no tillage. So all these things are potentially operations that can be done relatively easily to be able to qualify for this type of a project. This is a bit of a timeline of what is required. And so I suppose this is probably when we talk about what's the price of carbon going to be into the future. If you're looking at setting up a carbon project now, you're really not going to be baselining until 2027, or you'll be doing an initial baseline as soon as you can, but the second baseline won't be until 2027, and that's about the time when you'll potentially have carbon to sell. So that will be, you have to be forecasting what the price is going to be in 2027 rather than at this very point in time. And we can't predict the future, but the indications are that carbon's a commodity. It's going to be supply and demand, and there'll be a lot of big emitters looking at wanting to offset their carbon emissions by that time. So yeah, in nature, there are no rewards or punishments. There are only consequences, and that's why we feel that the soil carbon can offer a great benefit to improve the consequences of storing carbon. Thank you.
Just wanted to thank Mick for that last session. We've just got probably about 15 minutes for our panel session. So what we're going to do also is just introduce Dr. Susan Orgill, who will join us along with Mick, Stuart, Cathy, and also Doug. And Dr. Ogle is with the New South Wales DPI. She's a soil scientist, and she specialises and is passionate about delivering farm-ready research focusing on strategies to increase soil carbon and nutrient cycling in agricultural soil. So we saw also some of the references in Mick's presentation that were related to Dr. Ogle there. So if our panellists could maybe just turn their cameras and microphones back on. Thanks again for those wonderful presentations. We certainly have had a lot of questions coming through in the chat, and it's been great that you've also been able to answer some of those as there as well. I guess a number of things have popped up. Obviously, we've spoken about this morning about reducing the emissions on one side, but also seeing how we can sequester carbon on the other side and trying to get that balance right in on-farm and practical practices on the farm. But one thing that's popped up a bit through the chat, and a question that I think everyone asks a lot of, is what about the early adapters? How do they get treated when we're doing the bench lining, or if we're going to participate into a scheme? We've seen some of those emissions have reduced since 1990. There's been plenty of programs like land care and on-farm activities. How are they treated in such of these programs? So I might throw that to you first, Mick, if that's all right.
Yeah, good question, Niall. I think probably, so there's the new methodologies going to widen the scope of additionality, that some of the inputs that can be used. I think one of the things that when answering this question you want to be really mindful is, if you are an early adopter and you have got your soil carbon levels up, you're actually getting the production benefits from that, and you have been getting that compounded for however long. So you're probably running quite a profitable, resilient business, and that's ultimately what we're wanting to do. And the environment is through the cycling side of it. The environment's getting the benefit from that. Potentially from a socialist perspective, you could say, well, hang on, I'm not getting paid for this, and Joe Blow down the road is, but what you are getting paid for is the production. And that's, the production is what pays the bills and what makes a profitable business. So I think that's what we want to be focusing on, not getting too concerned about you missing out. There's a little bit of debate, or not a little, there's a lot of debate actually around the upper limit of where soil carbon can be stored, and we would still be always advocating to get, even if you have been doing something great for 20 or 30 years, to baseline as deep as you can go, and then because potentially you're going to be getting that carbon going to depth, and so that's how I'd answer that.
Did you want to add to that, Stuart, from your point of view?
Yeah, it's a really valid point. We haven't done much with vegetation and trees and so forth. Obviously we've planted a lot of them, but even when we were planting those trees and we asked about potential carbon gains from them, and they said it's nowhere near enough. The number of trees that we need to plant to be out, and vegetation increase that we need to create from a carbon perspective in this environment is order of magnitude versus some of the guys in the Western Division where their natural vegetation recovery that's where it's much more applicable. Soil carbon for us, however, and that was one of the reasons why we pursued the Regen Network deal that we did, because we'd seen those gains and recognising that those gains are only in the top 15 centimetres. So there's still, and that's why we said, well, even if that Regen deal doesn't come off, and we may have reached somewhat of a plateau or a saturation point in the top 15 centimetres. If we have, that means we're starting to build it below 15 centimetres, down to a metre. And so there's still plenty of upside down there. So we have, and in that project, we have only sold the carbon in the top 15 centimetres. We're somewhat committed to that project now in that year on year, going forward. As we sequester more carbon, we've sort of got to keep going to that Regen Network model, which is fine, and that will improve in its rigour over time. But the other aspect, because we baseline, we've also got that carbon's been analysed with the carbon link technology, which is some of the highest, most technically advanced technology in the world, down to a metre. So we've got carbon from 15 centimetres to a metre that we can potentially find a market to try and sell in 5 or 10 years' time if we go and take all those measurements again.
That's great, thank you, and also great to see we've now got Susan and Doug back on the screens as well. Susan, I'll come to you in a moment, and we've got to make some comment about that shirt on the way through as well. So we'll actually we could talk about all the panelist shirts. It's always been a pretty amazing part of the morning. One of the things that I guess was raised in a number of the presentations as well is that, what we do here, the methodologies that we use, our baselines, our validation is also part of something that's a bit bigger. So obviously we've got different jurisdictions within Australia. And I guess we could probably all say that we've never been more fractured to a degree about every state doing their own thing at the moment than what we're seeing in some parts of what we're seeing at the moment across Australia. But then also we've got that connection with international trading markets. So I might start, Cathy, maybe if you could reflect on what our methodologies and the work that New South Wales DPI is doing, how that relates to anything that's happening in Canberra or even with some of the other states. And then Doug, I might get you to maybe make a comment on how our methodologies and what we're doing here is either going to be recognised or where it plugs in internationally with what's happening, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere. So Cathy, how do you link in with Canberra, and how do you make sure that what we do is going to be part of something that is Team Australia?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And, there's been a lot of recent changes in the way in which methods under the Emissions Reduction Fund are currently developed. So in the past, they took quite a lot of time. There were an awful lot of methods that were out there, with very few methods having uptake. So the way in which the methods are produced now is far more rapid, and it's far more consultative. So we can find ourselves sitting in a room with the carbon market developers, with landholders, talking about soil carbon method development, which, as Michael indicated, we've got a new, hopefully more workable method that'll come out for soil carbon later this year. So the whole idea is that the federal government has looked to try and make sure that there's, that methods are more broadly applicable rather than having lots of specific methods, and that it's capturing a whole lot of activities under the one method. So to try and reduce that complexity. I will say this relates to one of the questions that I haven't answered that's come up in the chat too around environmental plantings, so tree plantings on farms, that the Clean Energy Regulator has now also looked at reducing the monitoring verification reporting that's associated with environmental plantings, because it's pretty secure. You can use remote sense data to see that the trees are there, so the less costs for reporting, which means that that'll open it up for small scale projects. You won't need the really large scale projects to have a viable operation. So all of that is ongoing and consultative. But, you know, there are other jurisdictions like Queensland that have the Land Restoration Fund that value co-benefits internally as well. So there are those activities that occur across Australia.
Yeah. Thanks, Cathy. Mick, did you want to add on that?
Yeah, I just really would love to add to Cathy's point. And in the new methodology, something I meant to mention in my presentation is they're actually looking at a modelled and measured methodology. So that will be using some physical baselining measurements, but also over time, hopefully through better technology, if we can get the accuracy of the modelled measurement very close to the actual baselining measurement, the physical measurement, then that will significantly reduce the cost for the farmers going forward. Probably still potentially need that really accurate on-ground baseline, but going forward, you think about where the technology, how far it's come in the last 10 years and what could potentially happen in the next 10 years. There's going to be a lot of drive to be able to bring that cost down. And I think that the opportunity through satellite technology, even potentially a drone technology for higher accuracy vegetation, could really, significantly bring that baseline cost down.
Great. Thanks, Mick. And Doug, as a representative of MLA, I guess championed with taking that brand and Team Australia and taking on the world. How do we plug into that international market, and particularly with other schemes and other systems happening around the world?
Sure. So Niall, we'll first start by saying let's acknowledge that there's multiple markets emerging for carbon credits and environmental services, and they're comprised of a myriad of buyers. So the Australian federal government's one buyer on behalf of the Australian community. Each country globally is now entering into as a buyer, and there are private businesses who are buying, and there are also consumers who are buying. And the way in which they make those decisions is based on this notion of methodologies that enables us to communicate to those buyers how we went about meeting their expectation. The complication we have, and actually before I say my next point, that's the same with everything we do in agriculture. If we're producing red meat, there are different ways of producing red meat that complies with what the market is telling us they want to see. And we're seeing that emerge in carbon markets and in biodiversity markets at the moment. And so what we have to do is trade off this balance, or strike this balance between quality and price or reward. So we want to give in Australia, we hold ourselves to the highest standards internationally, because we recognise that internationally, we're a rounding error in the supply of agricultural commodities globally. And so for us to compete, we need to compete on something that's unique. And Aussies are really good at competing on quality. We provide high quality, clean, safe, integral product to consumers who are willing to pay. And so on one hand, we want to get a higher price, but we also then need to demonstrate quality. So not surprisingly, the Australian government's approach is high integrity, high standard, high accuracy, high confidence. But you've heard from a number of speakers today, Stuart and Michael in particular, saying, well, look, we've got to balance that off with what you're willing to pay. Because if I'm the person in the middle trying to meet your need, I need to make a profit. And that's been driving the innovation. So you've heard Cathy and I guess Susan probably made some comments, and I'm sorry I dropped off, had some technical issues, but comments to the effect of how do we innovate to provide quality at a price that farmers can remain profitable at. Now, Niall, my only other comment is, if we get that balance right, we are going to get access to every international market. And that's the drive for innovation in this area, is meeting that need to a high quality and position it to the right market so we get the best return we possibly can. And that's a really interesting marketing consideration for producers, is pick your market, because there are multiple markets for these services. And, you know, Stuart's given a great lived experience of an early market entrant, and no doubt he's learned a lot in that process. And we'll be looking for new market opportunities in the future.
That's great. Thank you. Look, Susan, it's been great that you've been able to jump on and provide some answers into the Q&A section as well. But look, this is going to be the easiest lob for a question.
Yep.
The shirt says it all, right? Soil
Yeah,
will save us. Tell us how we've heard from some of the presenters today about what's happening with their soil and what they're trying to achieve under the ground. This is just a very simple one. How is it going to save us, and what's applicable to our livestock producers here, and what can they be doing?
I think, well, if we just start from the basics, it's the only product you can sell in terms of soil carbon off farm where you still retain all of those benefits that Stuart and Michael spoke about. So you're still getting that nutrient cycling, water holding capacity, all the things which underpin production for our livestock graziers. So I think it's a bit of a no-brainer. Like, often I get asked around, are there strategies to increase soil organic carbon? There's lots of literature out there to say, yes, there are strategies where you can build your carbon and have agricultural production at the same time. Are you going to make millions out of it? Well, some people do, but should you be doing it anyway? Absolutely, because there's benefits beyond trading.
Yeah, that's great. And that's, I guess, back to the point that you were making, Mick, as well, that even the early adopters, they've probably seen a bit more of a resilient operation and business model and productivity as a bonus. So, Susan, where do you start when you start looking at this? We've heard a lot about measuring and benchlining and those sort of things. Where would you start if you were one of our producers that were wanting to do this, noting that we know that it's a long process? Is the first port of call to get in an expert to come in and do an analysis? Where would you start?
I don't know. It depends if you want to. If for trading, yeah, look, there's people out there that have got those skills which can help you navigate all the barriers and the complexities around that. But if it's just about building soil organic carbon, it's about knowing your own canvas, like know your soil, know your production system, understand what your productivity goals are, because building soil organic carbon, a lot of those strategies have direct synergies with increasing and sustaining productivity as well. So I think really it just starts in the paddock, thinking about where are those responsive zones, where can you get those biggest gains? And a lot of the strategies, I guess, to sequester carbon are about growing more biomass. And if that's through nutrient management or grazing management, whatever you can do to influence that is going to have those synergies with increasing soil carbon. Measuring carbon in terms of a producer going out there and getting it on their agronomic soil test, that's really cheap and easy, and people should be monitoring and measuring that. That's like $10 or $12 a soil sample. That's not expensive. Certainly for carbon trading, there's a whole lot of integrity and kind of other layers that go in there. So that's where the cost comes in. But people should be considering soil organic carbon as fundamental to their farming businesses.
That's great, and unfortunately time has got us today. I'm going to give you all one more very quick question to answer, but before I do that, thank you all for your time today. We probably could have done a whole day on just this topic, especially considering the amount of interest that's generated in the Q&A. But because we've had a short amount of time, because people are probably wanting to look for more in this space, I'm going to ask you each where to from here. If you could advise the people that are watching this today where to go next. This could be a plug to your own websites, for example, but very quickly, let's run around and say, where should people go from here if they want to see more about this? So I'll start with you, Mick.
Well, yeah, for us, it really is a plug, because RCS and Carbon Link are in the business of educating farmers on how to improve soil carbon. But it's not just about us. I go to anywhere for reputable advice and talk to people who have done it. Stuart's done a great job of promoting what they've been doing there at Wilmot. And as Sue sort of says, think about the co-benefits. You can't store soil carbon in isolation. If you're storing soil carbon, you're getting production benefits, and there's the potential for some off-farm income with it as well.
Great. Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, I'd reiterate that point there. RCS and CarbonLink have been a huge support to us and a huge resource. In addition to that has been My Grazing, and they've, endorsing so much of RCS's work and have also been, really helping to create this discussion around carbon. Our own Facebook page, our Wilmot Cattle Company Facebook page, I regularly post stuff on there. We've been really adamant about sharing what we do for the benefit of everyone else. Us talking so much about what we do in the last 6 months has not been about blowing our own trumpet or trying to beat our own drum. It's absolutely been about trying to help other people. And that comes, right from the people that own this business to myself, our crew. We're really adamant about helping others and again, coming back to creating resilient agricultural businesses. Sue's talked about focusing on soil carbon and why it's important for all those production benefits and how you can just get some basic samples done. Do that because it's good business. Do that because soil carbon, you can increase soil carbon somewhat organically by removing, a lot of those synthetic inputs. You're reducing a lot of cost, you're reducing risk, you'll see production benefits in your business. Lo and behold, you might increase some soil carbon. You can also potentially look at trading that.
That's great. Thank you. Susan?
See our researchers enabling you to kind of try things on your own property. So it's about the nuance of how you could give the same recipe to 5 people, get 5 different cakes, like bake your own cake. I actually didn't think about saying that. That obviously just went straight from the brain to the mouth.
That's
but
that's
there we
that's
go.
A great analogy. It's a great analogy. Fantastic. Cathy?
Okay, so just to fill the gaps on what people are saying, I think if you're really interested in undertaking activities that aren't directly linked to a market, then going locally and getting as much local advice from trusted sources, landholders, from government, from LLS, DPI. But if you are really interested in going to carbon markets, the information is really fractured. One good place to start is to go to the Carbon Market Institute and have a look at who, like CarbonLink, Green Collar and others, who have signed up to the Carbon Market Industry Code of Practice, which allows them to have a high level of integrity, and then go to those carbon market developers and talk to them. You've met Stuart and Michael today. And talk to those that are actually participating in markets. So both the market developers and those that are participating in markets.
That's great. Thank you. And Doug, I've left you to last. You get the last word because MLA were a wonderful supporter of this session. So as a sponsor, you got to open the batting, and now you get to bowl the last over. So where to from here, Doug?
Thanks, Niall. A couple of pieces of information. So check out the MLA website, punch into Google MLA CN30 or go to www.mla.com.au/CN30. You'll get access to really good information. I agree with Cathy's comment about check out the code of conduct that governs carbon project developers, but talk to your supply chain. I would really like to see these credentials be attached to the products we supply to the world. That requires supply chains working together. So if you sell cattle or sheep or goats to the next person down the supply chain, pick up the phone and ask them what they're doing in this area and see if you can do something together.
Look, that's great advice. Thanks again to all of our panelists this morning. Thanks for the questions, everyone. Just enough time now to go and get a cup of coffee. You can stay on and watch some information coming through from our sponsors, or you can stay on in the chat function and talk to people. At 11 o'clock, you'll be put back to the main screen, and then you get to pick where to go there. There's a concurrent session then on beef and also on lamb. You get to pick from there. Thanks again to our panelists, and go and grab a cup. Cheers.